Hello, viewers, and welcome back to our new edition of Money Matters Monday. This is a continuing series that we have on school finance with our podcast. And today we're talking about the Washington State funding mechanism called the prototypical school funding model. I'm joined again today by our Director of Finance and Operations, Marshall Cruz. Marshall, welcome.
Thanks, Josh. I'm super excited to talk about prototypical school model today. So hopefully we won't put anybody to sleep.
This is a critical piece to school financing. Really, once this is understood, you understand how staff allocations are impacted and how levy dollars are used. It's such a critical piece in the whole mechanism. Um, but before we get to that, we've talked about the funds that make up our school finance. In our last episode, we talked about the general fund. Um, Today, prototypical school funding model. It's sort of, where do we start, Marshall? And maybe this impacts the general fund. So maybe just give us a quick overview of where we're headed.
Yep. Just really quickly, refresher on the general fund. There's three buckets of money that enter the general fund: state, local, and federal. The general fund is 90% of our total budget for everything, and about 80% of that comes from state revenue. And state revenue is generated, the majority of that is generated by the prototypical school funding formula.
Well, and maybe we need to start by just breaking down the words. So prototypical, I mean, just that means likely. I mean, it's what is typical or likely example or experience.
Yeah, it's almost like a standard. I mean, every school is different. Every school district is different. You know, our middle school may have 500 students, our high school may have 600, our elementary school may have 500 students. What the state did was they determined that the prototypical elementary school has 400 students, and then they base staffing on that 400 students. And if you have more than that, well, it's a simple ratio. If you have 500 students, well, you get, what is that, 20%, 25% more staffing units than you would if you had 400 students.
So it's based on that, what prototypical is, and then funding mechanism. I mean, that is just, I mean, we look at it in layman terms, our paycheck is that reliable source of income that comes in. Um, how does that equate to a school district then with funding
I guess,
mechanism?
the bulk of our state revenue comes through that prototypical school funding model. And it's an allocation method where it kind of is built by enrollment. So your enrollment feeds this formula that spits out the number of staff you can have in a bunch of different categories. And then the state assigns statewide. So backing up a second, this formula is used by every school district statewide. The formula is exactly the same whether you're in Granite Falls, Lake Stevens, Seattle, Spokane. How it generates staffing is exactly the same no matter where you are. The thing that changes the funding is how it allocates money for each staff member that is generated.
Before we get into some of those decisions on how, so, we have so many students and we're going to get funding based on that, and decisions that are made, let's just talk about the history. How old is this funding formula, and what are the pros and cons when it comes to? I mean, let's just talk about our district. What are the pros and cons to Granite Falls School District?
So I've been in the state of Washington for 6.5 years. So this predates me. So I did research to find out how it all originated, and apparently this current version of the way schools are financed using the prototypical school funding models began in 2009. There was a bunch of legislation that was passed to kind of revamp how schools were funded. in 2009. And there's been other incremental steps along the way. The McCleary Act of 2017, I think, changed the dollar amount that each staffing unit was funded for, but the formula for how many staff it should take to run a school began in 2009.
So what are one of the pros you've already talked about? It sort of provides that equity from district to district. So
yeah, it's a universal standard across the state of Washington that says that if you have this many students in an elementary school, you should be able to operate with this many staff. And if you need less staff, that's okay. If you need more staff, you've got to find a way other than the prototypical state funding mechanism to pay for those staff.
So I think this is a great point. There's not like an accreditation standard or an expectation based on the prototypical funding model that you have to have X number because of the funding formula. That's where local control comes in.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So that's the pro. What's the con for us?
I guess I would say that the model does a really good job of allocating teachers. It's a simple ratio of class sizes. So, for instance, at the K3 level, it allocates one teacher for every 17 students. Simplifying the numbers a little bit. There's some other little minor factors for teacher prep time and stuff that contribute to that, but 1 is 17. When you get to the 4th and 5th grade level, I believe it's 26 or 27 to one teacher. When you get 6 to 12, I think it's 28.5 or so for every one teacher. And so every school district, if they're a high school, for every 28 and a half students they have, they get a teacher. A teacher can be used any way we want to use it, but it's the same everywhere you go. So that is definitely, that part of it works well. How the amount of money you get for that staffing unit from the state doesn't work so well. And the other thing that doesn't work so well is it's a terrible model for support staff. So paraeducators, nurses, psychologists, secretaries, principals, all of those support staffs, anything that's not a teacher, the model really doesn't do a great job of staffing.
So I want to dig in here a little bit because this is an important point. And so I want to talk about school nursing for just a minute. So, of course, we have an obligation to provide services when we serve students that might be on a individualized education plan that requires some nursing assistance, or if we have a student with a fragile medical condition, again, we have that obligation. We take the place of parents during the day. Parents send students here. We have that obligation to serve in that role and meet those needs. So we have this role in this oversight, but how many nurses does Granite Falls get based on the prototypical model? And then I'm going to ask you, how many do we get, or how many do we need?
Nursing is a great example. So the prototypical school funding model for Granite Falls generates 1.9 nurses based on our 2,300 students that we have enrolled here. So 1.9 nurses.
So we get 1.9, and how many do we actually have?
We have 8. I think most people would think that it'd be reasonable to have either a nurse or a health room attendant, just one at every school. That should probably be the bare minimum. We have 5 schools. The bare minimum should be 5. We have 8 because we have certain students that have severe medical conditions that need to have a nurse at their side at all times. And that's not unusual. A lot of schools in the state have that.
And we want to be clear. We are happy to provide that service. We're obligated. and we want to provide whatever service that is needed. But our point is that this is an antiquated funding model that is not keeping up with times with when it comes to school nursing.
Well, yeah, I mean, setting aside the unusual circumstances of a student that needs special treatment, every school should have a nurse or a health room attendant. I mean, that should be the minimum standard.
Let's go down the road of office professionals. Is there a ratio that, or is there is that part of the funding formula that
So it
tells us
does
how many were allocated? And
it does okay with office professionals. It does okay with custodians. Office professionals, it allocates 9. We have 10. Custodians, it allocates 7.5. We have 10. Where it really hurts us is paraprofessionals is terrible. Technology, counselors, those types of positions are terrible.
well, do you have access to that technology piece of what?
I do. So the funding model allocates 1.1 person to handle all the technology needs of our entire school district of 5 schools unreal. And 2,300 students.
Considering
we operate extremely lean with 3, and we could sure use more, but the model says we should be able to operate with 1.
That's another great example, because we could easily keep another person really busy, if not 2 more people in that area. Being a 1-to-1 district with all the technology that we have, which is great for students, and we want to do that, but it's tough when we don't have the staffing support to do that. It seems to me that this should be updated. Is there any sort of conversation going on at the regional or state level for this, and what are the struggles that other districts are facing when it comes to?
Sure, it has been a push from all associations that are attached to schools, WASA, WASDA, WASBO. It's been the top of their legislative priorities is to revamp the prototypical school funding model. There's been bills introduced every legislative session for, I don't know, the past 4 or 5 years to try and revamp that, to make it more reasonable for how a school should run. But the unfortunate thing is that when McCleary was settled, the main messaging that came out from news and the legislature was that schools are fully funded. And we've finally fixed it. Let's celebrate. Washington State schools are fully funded. But clearly that's not the case. And, there's legislation introduced to increase the prototypical school funding model. There is legislation in process that has been enacted to increase social emotional ratios. So counselors, psychologists, but it's still minuscule, the increases they're doing. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket. There is some legislation to better fund paraeducators that is on the table, but there is this tremendous backlash from the legislature that, hey, we fixed this problem already 5 years ago. Schools are fully funded, but they introduced a mechanism that had more adequate pay for teachers, but it didn't address the staffing that is really needed to run a school.
So, Marshall, this leads us to the conversation we'll have in a deeper conversation in our next podcast when we talk about bonds and levies. But we haven't really touched on the impact today with prototypical model and what that means for levies, because as we just said, we want to provide nursing, but how do we pay for that since it's not being funded through that? So I guess my big question is prototypical funding, and what impact it has on bonds and levies, and then maybe go a little bit deeper on the levy piece, because that certainly is how we help pay for some of these things.
Sure. And this is kind of an introduction to our next podcast, but essentially the prototypical school funding model, I think we run pretty lean. I think most parents in the district, most students in the district, most staff members think we run a pretty lean ship here. You know, we don't have a whole lot of extras. Even with that, we're short almost $2 million in funding for the teachers that we have. We're short almost $900,000 in principals. Principals is administrators. The funding model generates 5 administrators. Administrators would be principals, assistant principals. Most schools should operate with a principal and an assistant principal, and just that alone would be 10. So half of what we need is funded by the state. And then classified staff, which are those secretaries, custodians, maintenance workers, we're short $1.3 million. So what that means is, and this is not a Granite Falls problem by any stretch of the imagination. This is every school district in Washington will have similar numbers, and the fix for that is that we are allowed to ask our taxpayers locally to help fund that gap that the state doesn't pay for. So we, every 4 years, go out for a levy that asks our taxpayers to enrich. Kind of a funny thing is they consider having one nurse at each school an enrichment to our school district, not something that's needed, but something that we are choosing to do that enriches the experience for our students. But we're allowed to do that through the levy process.
And that's where it shows why it's so antiquated, because originally levies were there for that supplemental, that enrichment, but because the state does not fully fund all of our needs, we really do have to go to the local taxpayer and say, we're just trying to get by. We need to provide either paras or nursing or IT, and we're so grateful for our community because they do support those, but there really is a need to update this funding formula. So, Marshall, we're about ready to wrap up, but before we do have some viewer questions. So,
all right then.
I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please email us, and there's the email below, and you can send those in, and we look forward to answering those questions here on our podcast, Money Matters Monday. So, question number 1. That's a great one, Marshall. Ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Viewer asked, the federal government is allowed to run a deficit and gets deeper into debt every year. 1, can school districts do that, and what keeps a school district from doing that?
So most states, so there's no federal law that says states can't run a budget deficit similar to the federal government and sell bonds to fund their deficit or to make up their deficit. There's no federal law that restricts states from doing that. But most states have something in their constitution that says they can't. Washington State has a balanced budget amendment in their constitution. I believe it was enacted somewhere in their mid 2000s, like 2012 or something. And as part of that, OSPI has rule setting that says school districts cannot run a deficit budget. And if we get to a point where we are possibly going to, or we build a budget that says we're going to, or we end the year with a negative balance, we go into this what's called binding condition with the state. And that is we have to form a plan in cooperation with our local ESD and the state for how we're going to get out of that negative balance and how we're going to balance our budget very soon in order to be in compliance with the state regulations.
So basically, you're reinforcing a conversation point from our last podcast, and that is the importance of having a reserve so that
Absolutely.
you do not go into binding condition. And from one of our board of directors this year, there are approximately 3 school districts in the state that are in that binding condition, but it's projected to be, I believe, as many as 20 or 22 headed that way. So there are rough times, but again, just shows how important it is to have a reserve and why that's been such a priority for our board of directors and for our school district. All right, question number 2. Different topic. Who owns the buses? Lake Stevens or Granite Falls?
So we are in a transportation cooperative with Lake Stevens. We're a smaller school district. It would be financially burdensome for us to try and run that whole program on our own. But we own the buses. We buy the buses. They are ours. We own our transportation depot that we have here. We own our trailer. The Lake Stevens Cooperative hires the drivers. The Lake Stevens Cooperative pays the drivers from a Lake Stevens paycheck, but they bill us for the cost of the drivers. They bill us for the fuel that we expend, and they bill us for a share of the overhead, a shared cost of overhead, which is about 25% of the total overhead between the two districts. We have a investment into the cooperative that is we have a share of the total cooperative, kind of as a ratio of size to size, Lake Stevens to us.
All right.
But we own our buses. We insure our buses ourselves. I guess you could say they own our drivers, but they hire the drivers, they train the drivers, they pay the drivers with the Lake Stevens paycheck. They all come to our transportation depot here. They have their offices here. Their buses are parked here, right between the high school and Monte Cristo, and they bill us for those costs.
All right. Well, 2 great questions again. So viewers, if you have a question, please email those, and look forward to sharing those at a future podcast. Marshall, as always, thank you. I think it's important for our stakeholders to have a good grasp on our financial, how schools are financed, and our own finances. We have more podcasts coming up on Money Matters Monday, and appreciate your time again. Yeah, go ahead.
So one comment, it's going to be 2 weeks before this next podcast comes out, and you're all getting your voting pamphlets in the mail. It's really important to support your local school districts, whether it's Marysville, Arlington, Sultan, Monroe. The school districts can't do it. The state does not give the school districts enough to run their operations, and it's super important that you support those local levies. And if they're running a bond, really trying to understand what they're running the bond for. And we'll talk about that more next time, but those ballots are in the mail, and you'll be having those ballots soon. And you'll be voting, you might vote before our podcast comes out, but support your local school districts.
Yep, that's great. And so, just to be clear for our own local viewers, we do not have anything on the ballot, but other voters in neighboring districts, they might be having levies or bond conversations. And so I would agree. Make sure you get informed and get out and vote. So, all right. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back for our next podcast. Again, Marshall, thanks for joining today. And thank you, viewers, for watching.